Hi everyone. We've got 15 minutes, so I'm going to talk fast, and I've tried to keep this fairly simple. I'm probably preaching to the converted here at Games for Change. So if everything I'm saying is obvious and self-evident, I apologize. So what I want to talk about today is something that's important to me, which is reaching new audiences and doing that through genre and character. And when I'm talking about audiences, I'm talking about big, broad audiences. Video games, interactive stories, it's essentially a broadcast medium. So I'm very interested in trying to reach a large number of people with interesting stories. And when I talk about genre, I'm talking about story genre as opposed to game genre. So something that's kind of painfully obvious when you work within the traditional video games industry is there comes a point when people reach a certain age and they just start dropping off out of the industry, moving into different careers, or they stay in the industry but they're less engaged in games themselves. And the main reason for this, as far as I'm concerned, is when you look at mainstream video games, we have such a narrow set of genres and characters that we deal with, that the stories we're telling, they don't speak to a rich, deep part of our being. They don't tell us stories which are going to kind of broaden our experience of life. And this is something that I think sees people moving away. And they watch more TV and they read more books and they get burned out on games. Most big budget mainstream games have a very narrow remit in terms of the genres that we can address. And I think there's this kind of facade we put out where we talk about numbers and budgets and how much money video games make and pretend that somehow we are the preeminent medium. But I think there's a painful truth, which is that the core audience for these big games is not necessarily growing. And I think there's a much larger audience we could tap into. And for me, the way to do this is by thinking more deeply about genre and character. Most recently, my experience in this regard is with the game that I put out actually a year to this day, exactly to this day. Last year I put out a game called Her Story. Now when I developed Her Story, it was the lowest budget I've worked with. Traditionally I've worked on much larger kind of console games. This was a much smaller thing. And as I was developing it, I knew that this was, in my mind, quite a niche thing. It was this non-linear narrative piece with an unconventional mechanic, so probably had quite a small audience. But as I worked on it and as I showed it to people, and then as the game released, I realized that actually there was a much broader audience for this game. And it reached out to people who don't normally play video games. It reached out to people who were burned out on traditional video games. And I think ultimately this comes down to the way in which it used genre. This was a game that took place in the police procedural genre. So when you showed it to people who don't play video games, they got it. They knew what this was, they knew what the experience involved. You didn't have to explain to them what the point of the game was, how you interacted with it. It had this kind of unconventional mechanic in which you had to search this database to find video clips. But everyone that sat down in front of it, they understood this. They understood that in a police procedural, there is an investigation, there is a mystery, there are questions, there are evidence, there are clues, and that you explore your way through them. All of the kind of mechanics and the abstract mechanics were explained to them by the metaphor of the police procedural and through their understanding of that genre. It also, for me as a creator, the genre is what helped create this piece. So when I found those new mechanics, when I started to create this experience, the thing that was driving me in these new directions and away from all my traditional learnings as a game designer was the genre, a genre that I love through TV and through novels. And trying to follow that genre and be true to it and true to its rules is what helped me create this experience. Genre to me is such an important tool as a storyteller. I did actually have originally this slide was a comparison, and I was going to show like the top selling video games, but it was so depressing. It was I mean, you've seen the images yourselves probably. It's all kind of white dudes with guns, and if you look at TV and you look at film, and these are industries which are not necessarily famous for their approaches to diversity and characters and experiences, you still see this huge range of experience, because as evil and cynical as these industries are, they're primarily interested in telling a story to a broad audience. So they're going to try and tell stories and experiences which appeal to a large audience. So, if you look at these TV shows from last year, yeah, you have your dark fantasy and you have your zombies, but you also have political dramas, political comedies, you have legal thrillers, you have dramas set in the world of advertising, you have techno thrillers with young hacktivists, you have this huge range, and you have series built around female characters. You have tons of sitcoms and comedy. I mean, this is one of the kind of hardest things to get your head around, is like comedy is such a mainstay of most mediums, and in video games we really struggle with it. So, there's a lot of room for us to cover. These other mediums, they are richer. They do speak to a broader audience. If you go and pick a film or a TV show to watch tonight, you're going to have more to choose from. You're going to find experiences which teach you something about the world in a deeper and more interesting way than many, many mainstream video games. I don't want to sound too negative on video games, though. And I think something that is very clear to me when I speak to people around these issues is it's very easy to look at video games, especially the mainstream video game, and imagine that it's always been this way, and that the genres we have, these very rigid genres we have always been there. But actually, there's always been a ton of experimentation and exciting stuff within the mainstream video game world. Like, I grew up as a youngster on the 8-bit kind of machines in the UK, and I was playing games like, these were just a few ones I picked out. There's this game, Frankie Goes to Hollywood, which was based on a pop group, and you were in a kind of future utopia investigating a murder mystery whilst popping pills and then engaging in some sort of Cold War thing. It was bizarre. And there were games set in schools. There was this game, Deus Ex Machina, which chronicled the 7 stages of man, started off with you as a sperm whilst listening to this kind of prog rock soundtrack with spoken word poetry. There's games where you were the manager of a rock band. There was this game, Vera Cruz, that I was obsessed with, which was a police procedural from France. At the bottom there's this game, Fourth Protocol, which was the game where you were the head of the MI5 and you sat at your desk and filled out forms to surveil people. And, in those days, when I would get my monthly games magazine, I'd open it, every month there would be something new and fresh and exciting. There were these genres just being created and invented within the video game world, all sorts of different stories being explored. And it sometimes feels like we miss some of that in the mainstream video game market now. Also, back from that time, a company that did some great work, from my perspective, was a company called Infocom, who made text games, text adventures. And their remit was they wanted to bring in a broad audience, and they wanted to find people that they hadn't already brought in. And so the way they did that was through genre. And if you look at their titles up here, they had murder mysteries, they had detective stories, noir detective stories, they had some fantasy, they had some kind of literary sci-fi, they had treasure escapades, they had comedy, sci-fi comedy, sex comedy, they had an amazing spy game called Border Zone, they had a romance game, Plundered Hearts, which had a female protagonist. And it was fascinating to see them doing this and taking inspiration from outside the world of video games, from the traditions of storytelling. And they set a really strong example. And to continue kind of riffing on text games, again, this kind of forgotten history of video games. Like in the 80s, it kind of seems weird when you look back now, but companies like Electronic Arts put out this game called Amnesia, written by the novelist Thomas M. Disch. Mind Wheel was a game made by Robert Pinsky, who later became Poet Laureate. We had a game called Portal, which was this fascinating story of everyone on Earth suddenly disappears and you're trying to figure out what's going on. And these companies were really investing in story and exploring some of these different genres as a way of engaging new audiences and making the kind of video game world a richer, more interesting place. I think the interesting thing with text games was, because they use these kind of natural language engines for your interaction, you could invent a verb set particular to your story and your genre. So you weren't limited specifically by mechanics in the same way that you are with some of the more rigid video game genres now. If you were doing a police procedural, you could have new verbs that would relate to that. If you were doing a romance story, you could invent the verb kiss, and suddenly you could tell a completely different type of story and have different types of interactions. One of the things that wasn't so diverse and great within Infocom, apart from Plundered Hearts, generally all these protagonists were male. There was a couple of British companies, Magnetic Scrolls and Level 9, doing these text games. And again, I was kind of obsessed with these games. And I was obsessed with one game in particular, which was this game on the left, Snowball, which was this kind of dry sci-fi game. It wasn't necessarily the best game ever, but its star was this character, Kimberly. And I'm not sure if it was ever kind of called out within the game itself, but she was this woman protagonist and presented solely in the kind of the manual artwork, in a very kind of naturalistic look. And I remember at the time, as a very young white man, looking at this game where I was playing this kind of 30-something woman, and it felt so grown up and sophisticated and interesting that I was actually getting to play someone different. It wasn't one of these silly, muscly barbarians. It wasn't one of these silly kind of fantasy figures. It just seemed to be a much more interesting, rich experience for me. And I've been in so many meetings with publishers where you show them a protagonist that isn't the muscly white guy space marine, and they're like, oh, well, is the 12-year-old boy going to want to play this character? And I used to get so mad because I was like, yes, this was like so exciting to me at the time when I was a young 12-year-old boy. And there was the same company did this series of games called there was Gnome Ranger and then Ingrid's Back, featuring this very interesting looking young woman gnome who kind of looks, she looks cooler on the right. She looks like kind of more punk there. But you know, it was so exciting for me that you would find these boxes and these games and you'd see these characters on them and you'd be like, that looks interesting. This looks something different. Another game up there, Corruption, was another one I was obsessed with, which was set in the financial world of London, and you would do kind of insider trading and dodgy dealing, and there was cocaine and hidden casinos. And that was, again, it was just so exciting to me that this was such a fresh story I was experiencing. And these companies, because they were using the kind of text medium, could just pick up these new stories and these new scenarios and characters and kind of run with them. And that was so exciting to me. And on the subject of character, something that kind of really upsets me is when I see people pitching the appeal of video games and interactive stories and VR as, what would you do? Here is this really cool scenario. What would you do in this scenario? What choice would you make? And I personally find that so boring because every morning I wake up and I decide what to have for breakfast. What shirt am I going to put on? Will I have the cold brew or an Americano? You know, my life is full of choices. I make choices as me every day. That's my life. My entire stream of life is me making choices. It's less interesting to me. For me, the heart of storytelling, what's so exciting about storytelling is the specific character. So at the moment, I'm doing a reboot of the movie War Games. And for this reboot, our main character is a 20-year-old woman called Kelly, who is a hacker activist. She comes from a military background. She has some tragedy in her past. She's kind of the surrogate mother to her brother. And this is exciting to me because what makes this story interesting, what makes the choices and the scenarios in this story is what would Kelly do in this situation? With her background, with the specificity of this character, everything she's been through, that becomes interesting to me. That is what's interesting about the story. And so the more interesting the character, the more different the character, the more specific the character can be, for me, that is what makes a story engaging. And this is something that comes from leveraging genre. If you use genre, you know, genre is essentially a taste profile. I say I like cop stories, I like police procedurals. That is my kind of taste. But if you tell me you've made a new police procedural, you need to freshen that up. You need to give me something I haven't seen before. And the way you do that is the character. And that becomes exciting because you're thinking, I know the rules of this genre. I know the scenarios. I know what typically happens in a police procedural. How is it going to be different this time? And then you go, well, look, it's Eddie Murphy. And he's not from Beverly Hills. He's kind of from the rough side of town. And there's all this kind of stuff from kind of 80s thrown in there. That's interesting. And then you have like The Killing or The Bridge, and you have these really interesting characters taking the main investigative role in these kind of police thrillers. And you're saying, well, here is this woman. She's 30. She's estranged from her son. How does that twist up the police thriller? When that police thriller gets personal, as they always do, how is that going to make it more interesting? Cracker was a show I loved, and you had this alcoholic psychiatrist. How is it different to have an alcoholic psychiatrist investigating rather than just the conventional police detective we're used to seeing? You know, if you work within genre, if you use genre to leverage the power of genre, then it forces you to create interesting characters, because that's how you keep things fresh. That's how you kind of play around with the rules. Genre as well is very exciting when you're creating video games. And when we create video games, we want to create new mechanics, new types of game. We want to explore new things. And again, genre is something that can push you in that direction. So I made a game called Silent Hill: Shattered Memories, which was a horror game in 2009. When we made that game, we were making it for the Wii audience. So we knew this was a fresh audience. We could kind of throw out the rules. And we looked at the horror genre. We looked at slasher things. We looked at slasher psychological horror. And we said, well, what is the action component in movies, in novels, in this genre? And the action component was running away. It was being pursued. It was being chased. It was being powerless. It wasn't getting a pipe and hitting someone over the head. That's the kind of zombie genre. And so we said, well, that's going to be the action component of our horror video game. It's going to be running away from things. And at the time, that was a very kind of left field idea. We had to really force that through. Now it's quite accepted that a lot of video game horror games are going to involve being chased around by enemies. But that was a case where we looked at the genre and we said, let's be true to this genre and pull that over into the interactive space, and it gave us a new piece of gameplay. It gave us a fresh angle on things. Technology can do interesting things and can help as well. So the 90s FMV boom is a fascinating era. Most of the stuff is rubbish. But it fascinates me because suddenly you saw this explosion of genre and character that you'd never seen before in video games. So there were tons of things you'd never seen before, like erotic thrillers. There's a couple on there if you can spot them. We had like slasher movies, things like Night Trap. We had legal dramas. It was such a kind of fertile period in that sense. And it came about because you had creators from the wider world coming in, people from a movie background or a TV background coming in to tell stories in this medium. The use of video is very interesting. It's something I'm continuing to pursue now because video enables character work. It enables you to kind of explore characters more deeply, do things that are more dialogue-based or character-driven in ways you can't if you're using 3D and CGI. It forced new mechanics because you can't do some things with video that you can do in normal video games. So as much as people berate Night Trap, it took the idea of the slasher film and of the voyeurism of that experience, and it created a mechanic around it. And then you look at something today like Five Nights at Freddy's, which essentially kind of updates and fixes some of that mechanic. And it's fascinating that they are able to tap into that and create something fresh and interesting. As well, when new technology comes in, genre is going to give you a framework. If you're looking at something like VR, which is such a fresh kind of new place to explore, and you're not sure how to make an experience in this world, if you have genre, you already have a framework. You have something that constrains not just you as the creator, but the player. So the player who's there saying, what do I do? I've got all these options. Genre kind of focuses you, tells you what your role is. You know the rules in genre. You know what things you're expected to do. And this new tech is going to help us create interesting new mechanics, and genre can help us kind of guide towards that. So for me, that's something that I'm really excited to see if we can explore in an interesting way within VR, and again, continuing with interactive video. Which I think, there was the missteps of the 90s and the FMV boom there, but I think now video is so ubiquitous that figuring out how interactivity works, rolling back some game-like stuff into the world of video and streaming video, I think is a real exciting space. In conclusion, this is something that I think kind of cuts to the core of things is, we often talk about video games and interactive experiences as being the medium of the future, the storytelling medium of the future. This is the way in which this generation, the next generation, will tell their stories and experience their stories. And if that's the case, then we need to be a medium which tells stories with greater diversity. We need to speak to and for the experience of these future generations. And for me, looking at genre, figuring out, bringing in genres we haven't explored interactively, understanding and taking apart those genres, and then using them to pull in new and interesting characters, that is going to be what allows us to create interesting new experiences. And it's going to create richer experiences, make our medium more powerful and useful. And that is that. We have 2 minutes if anyone has a single question, if it's short. Sure. I think it's kind of a core aspect of storytelling is that I think one of the beautiful things about storytelling is that you create a character that becomes the viewpoint character for the audience, but at the same time has some life of their own. So through them, you can experience vicariously the emotion and the kind of drama of the situation, but you have some kind of distance which allows you to think critically and kind of have some perspective on it. And I think that I think there's a difference between experiencing a story and possibly learning or kind of absorbing information. And for me, the magic of story is this kind of meshing of other characters and perspectives with our own. And the emotion is the thing that kind of draws you in. But yeah, having a defined character for me is what enables me to create a story around that. Yep.
Do you have any recommendations for dialogue writing that things you've learned, like too much dialogue, not enough dialogue, if it's too long or too short, that kind of.
I think a lot of it like for me, compression is such an interesting aspect, and it's something that we don't do in video games. I think video games is this medium that's very proud of uncompressing. Like I think the favorite part of my talk at GDC was I pointed out that in movies there's this gag where you never see the protagonist go to the toilet. You never see the protagonist driving in traffic because, a movie story is compressed. We take all the interesting points and boil it down and create this interesting narrative experience. In video games, not only do we let you see the toilet, you can go in and open every cubicle and you can flush them and you can wash your hands and you can do all this stuff. And there's something engaging about that, but it doesn't necessarily add to the narrative in my experience. And I think for so long we've pushed away from compression in video games. We unfurl, we allow you to explore continuous time, contiguous space. But I think one of the beautiful things about story is the way in which compression works, because compression leverages your imagination. So if we take, most stories are essentially the story of a life, and we figure out what's the most interesting part of that life, and we compress it into a 2-hour movie or a 5-hour book. And then through experiencing that story, you uncompress it in your brain, and it gives you this kind of attachment to it, and it allows you to experience in a very compressed form other people's experiences, different perspectives. And I think, for me, I'm very interested in trying to create interactive experiences and video game experiences that use types of compression. So some of the video stuff I'm doing, we're using kind of cinematic compression. We're able to use cuts and the kind of language of cinema to present something much more condensed. And there's great examples of that, like the game 30 Flights of Loving. I think is a beautiful example of using cinematic compression within a fully 3D video game. One more question? Sure.
Having gone through this, what do you want to do next?
So yeah, the big question I had, which kind of plays to the very first slide I put up, on finishing her story and seeing the reception was, I was kind of delighted because it was a very experimental project in terms of will there be an audience for this, will anyone like it? And finding that they did, and not only that, but there was this interesting audience that was a kind of broader audience, which I'd always wanted to speak to. Like when I made Silent Hill Shattered Memories, I was so excited about the Wii because the Wii was everywhere and it was in everyone's living room and it was people who might not normally sit down in front of a video game. And unfortunately, we didn't necessarily see eye to eye with Konami that was the audience we were trying to reach. But, so with her story, when it felt like I had managed to reach some of that audience, the big question for me then was, how do I go further? How do I, if 500,000 people have played her story or bought it, how do I meet 1 million, 2 million, 3 million people? How do I reach a much bigger audience like that? So the project I'm working on this very second, War Games, is going to be delivered through interactive streaming video. So anyone with a web browser or a phone will be able to access it. So we're in theory speaking to a very large audience and trying to create an experience which has all the benefits of interactivity, but in a way that's very accessible and kind of has an interesting texture to it. And we'll see how that goes. Thank you.